The scariest thing about humans, they don't even know how strong they are. The data was wrong. Not the numbers themselves, the numbers were fine, clean, properly arranged, filed in their columns the way I had been trained to file them since my first posting in the Xenological Division, 41. Prior assessments, over 30 cycles of field work, and every single one had produced a clean set of numbers that told a clean story. The gene produced extraordinary flight reflexes and almost no ground-based threat capability. Under monitor, the Varlith could strip atmosphere from a small moon with their chemical deterrence glands, file under extreme caution, recommend a generous containment buffer between them and anything fragile. 41 species, 41 clean stories. Then the humans. The numbers pointed everywhere at once. My supervisor assigned me to the assessment of the species designated GX7714, known colloquially in lower division. Reports as humans as a formality. He used that specific word, formality. I have replayed the conversation many times since arriving at the observation post, and each replay the word lands in a slightly different place in my processing. What he meant was, this will be quick. What I understood was, nothing interesting is waiting for you there. My supervisor had never been wrong about a species in 30 cycles. He was wrong about this one. The physical benchmarks came first. They always do. I processed them on the transit shuttle, sitting in the dark, with my data pad balanced on one knee, working through the columns in order. Bone density, moderate, prone to fracture under significant pressure. Muscular output, adequate for a mid-gravity biome, unimpressive against 6 other species sharing a similar gravitational range. Thermal regulation, inefficient. They manage body temperature through sweating mechanism that is metabolically expensive and ancient by evolutionary standards. Organ redundancy, strange. They have 2 copies of several systems. That one copy would adequately serve, and almost no backup for other systems that seem like they desperately need one. I filed the physical tier, low threat by biological metric, proceed to behavioral analysis. Behavioral analysis was where the filing system stopped cooperating. The archive footage provided covered 600 years of documented human activity. I started, as procedure requires, with threat response documentation. How does a species behave when the situation has moved beyond rational management? What does the behavioral profile look like when the odds have turned decisively against them? I expected retreat. I expected surrender signals. I expected the standard cascade of distress behavior that every catalog species produces when it encounters situation its survival instincts correctly identify as unwinnable. Instead, the first clip I reviewed showed a woman laughing while her arms were on fire. I want to be precise here, she was not in cognitive collapse. She was not experiencing shock-induced emotional misfiring. She was moving through a collapsed structure, her sleeves burning up to the elbows, and she was laughing because the man next to her had said something she found genuinely funny. She patted the flames out with her bare hands, shook the ash off her fingers, and kept moving through the rubble without pausing. I reviewed the footage 3 times. I filed behavioral data inconclusive. Recommend live observation. The live observation assignment placed me at a human military installation on the northern continent of their primary landmass. I arrived with a standard kit, a cover designation that required no direct interaction with the subjects and the expectation that 48 cycles would be enough to complete the behavioral tier and return to my actual office where 12 other assessments were waiting. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the sound. Not weapons, not machinery, voices. Cluster of soldiers near the southern perimeter fence already in full operational kit waiting for deployment. Order due within the hour, they were singing, not a coordination signal, not a call and response tactic drill, a song with an actual melody, some of them slightly off key in a way that did not appear to bother anyone. One soldier was drumming a rhythm on the side of a transport vehicle with the flat of his palm, eyes closed, fully committed to a performance that had no audience but the fence. I logged it, possible neurological stress response, group behavior, pre-engagement. I was wrong about this. I did not know yet that humans also sing alone, in private, when no one is watching, when the task at hand has nothing to do with music. I would understand this later. At this stage I logged it and kept watching. The deployment order arrived 40 minutes later. They stopped singing. That was the only ordinary thing that happened for the rest of the cycle. I was positioned at the training yard when the event occurred that I would later note in my private records, not my official report, as the moment my filing system broke permanently. A soldier was running a timed obstacle course. The supervising officer standing nearby told me, in the offhand way one shares a reassuring fact, that this particular soldier had been running courses like this for 11 years. 11 years, she said. Very experienced. The soldier took an injury halfway through, not a minor one. My field scanner calibrated that morning to human physiological parameters, flagged a grade 3 ligament rupture in the knee joint, and added a notation in red text, activity cessation recommended. The soldier did not stop. He finished the course, not shuffling through a ceremonial last stretch to technically complete the route. He ran. His time placed him in the upper quartile for the unit. He crossed the finish line, put both hands on his knees, breathed hard for 8 seconds, and then straightened up. Then he looked at the medic waiting nearby and he apologized. Not for the injury, not for needing attention. He apologized for the blood that had dripped from his knee onto the medic's boot, his own blood from his own injury landing on someone else's equipment, and his first response was concern about the inconvenience. I wrote 4 sub-reports on the apology before I noticed how many I had written. I did not know what I was looking for. The snag in the data would not come loose, and the more I pulled at it, the more I understood that the snag was not a processing error on my part. It was the data itself, a creature that finishes the task after the task has become physically inadvisable, a creature that, having done this, worries first about whether someone else was inconvenienced. I changed the behavioral status from inconclusive to active. Then I sat in the dark of my observation post and ran the numbers for the third time that cycle. They produced the same outputs. The physical benchmark still said low threat. The behavioral data still said something I did not have a category for. By the quiet, what kind of species does this? The graph keel ended 3 civilizations. before the coalition placed an expansion cap on their territory. I want to give that fact the weight it deserves. 3 civilizations, not contested border systems, not disputed colonies, not resource conflicts that were eventually mediated. 3 complete civilizations gone. The Grafkeel did not take prisoners and they did not negotiate once an engagement had begun. My division rated them at last formal assessment as severe threat, containment recommended, buffer zone minimum 12, orbital radii. Every species that had gone up against the Grafkeel had run the tactical model first and arrived at the same conclusion. Do not. The human military unit I was embedded with had apparently not run this model, or they had run it and someone had looked at the output and disagreed with it. I was not sure at the time which of those possibilities unsettled me more. I received the deployment briefing second-hand. The unit's commander, a man named Leon with a jaw that looked like it had been built for a heavier gravity than this one, delivered it in a field tent with a map spread on a folding table and a cup of something hot steaming near his elbow. He spoke for 12 minutes. His voice was flat and even, the kind of voice that does not change volume to indicate severity, so everything he said landed with the same weight whether he was talking about coordinates or casualty projections. He talked about casualty projections the same way he talked about coordinates. I noted this. The unit was 43 personnel, mixed specialties, mixed ages. The youngest was a soldier named Owen who looked, to my observation system, like he was approximately 19 standard years, and who cleaned his equipment with the focused intensity of someone who had recently been told that clean equipment is the difference between living and not. The oldest was a medic named Elise who moved through the pre-deployment preparations with the energy of someone running slightly behind on a schedule only she could see. There was also Connor. I noticed Connor because he was the one who had finished the obstacle course on the damaged knee the previous cycle. He was standing near the tent entrance with his weight distributed in a way that my scanner flagged as compensation for the injury, and he was eating something out of a wrapper and reading the briefing notes a second time. He read them the way someone reads a thing they already know, checking to make sure nothing had changed. Nothing had changed. I had filed a behavioral note about Connor. Subject demonstrates above average task completion drive with below average physiological self-monitoring. I read the note back that morning and thought it was technically accurate and completely wrong about what I had actually seen. The engagement began at low light on the second cycle. The Grafkeel's tactical methodology is well documented. They advance in structured formations. They communicate through subsonic pulse patterns. My monitoring equipment picks up as a low vibration in the floor, and they do not modify their approach based on casualties taken. Their modeling system identifies the most efficient path to objective completion, and they follow it. The efficiency of this approach had worked against every species they had previously engaged with, because every species they had previously engaged with had tactics built around minimizing loss. Human tactics are not built around minimizing loss. I understood this somewhere around the third minute of engagement, watching from my covered observation point as the unit absorbed a strike on their left flank. That should have caused them to redirect, regroup, pull back to reassess. Instead, Leon's voice came through the communication channel, flat and even as it had been in the briefing tent, redirecting 2 personnel from the center to cover the left while the rest continued forward. He did not pause. He did not change his tone. The Grathkeel's formation models cannot account for an opponent that absorbs and advances. Their system requires the enemy to flinch to create an opening, to move it a predictable direction determined by which angle of pressure is greatest. The humans were not moving in a direction determined by pressure. They were moving in a direction determined by objective, and no amount of pressure was changing the objective. The Grathkeel began making errors, small ones at first, a formation edge that tightened when it should have held, a pulse communication that came a half-second late, which for the Grathkeel is the equivalent of a shout of confusion. I had studied their behavioral patterns for 8 cycles before this posting. I had never seen them make an error in live engagement footage. They made 7 in the next 20 minutes. Then Connor went down. My scanner registered it as a significant impact event. The readout was not ambiguous. The field assessment flagged it in a category my instruments assigned a lethality probability of 94.3%. I stared at the number. I checked the calibration. The calibration was fine. Connor did not move for 4 seconds. Then he stood up. Not slowly, not carefully, the way damaged thing moves when it is aware of the damage. He stood up the way someone stands up when something has interrupted them in the middle of a task. He took stock of his equipment, checked that what he needed was still where it was supposed to be, and moved right, which was the direction Owen had been trying to hold and was struggling with. He looked annoyed, not frightened, not determined in the visible, dramatic way I had seen in footage of other species facing their worst moments. He looked the way someone looks when a small inconvenience has appeared in the middle of work they were already focused on, like a problem to move around, not a crisis to respond to. I looked at my scanner. The lethality field still read 94.3%. I stared at Connor moving across the field, and I stared at the scanner, and I had the very specific experience of holding 2 accurate pieces of information that could not both be true at the same time. I opened an incident report form. I filled in the lethality field. I deleted it. I filled it in again. The form was not built for this answer. The form assumed that a 94.3% event produced a result in a predictable category. It had 3 options: deceased, incapacitated, or continuing with injury. Connor was technically option 3, which is a category designed for someone continuing with a sprained wrist, not for a situation that my instruments were classifying as should not be happening. I filed it under option 3 and sat with the form open for a long time before I closed it. The engagement ended 40 minutes later. The Grathkeel retreated, which my division's database flagged as the 4th time in their entire documented history that the Grathkeel had retreated from an engagement, the 4th time ever. The unit lost 4 people. I watched what happened next from my observation point, and I am going to describe it precisely because I do not think my analysis was adequate to what I saw, and precision is the only tool I have. The soldiers who were still standing Stop, they did not debrief. Immediately, they did not run. Post-engagement assessments, they went to the 4 who had been lost, and they stayed with them. Some of them sat on the ground. Some stood with their hands at their sides. Elise the medic knelt down and did something I eventually understood was not medical, because there was nothing medical left to do. She stayed close, the way living things stay close to other living things when they staying is the only thing left. Some of them cried. I had extensive documentation on human crying in my behavioral files. I had categorized it as a stress response, a pressure valve for excessive emotional load. Watching it happen in front of me on a field where the ground was still warm. From the engagement, I understood that my categorization was technically correct and had missed the point entirely. Then Owen stood up from where he had been sitting on the ground. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He asked Leon where they needed to be next. Leon told him. They moved. I sat in my observation shelter for a long time after the unit had cleared the area. I had 3 incident reports open on my data pad. I had created 4 new data fields that afternoon, all of them for events that my standard assessment forms had no category for. None of the 4 new fields had the right name yet. None of them have the right name still. I returned to my primary observation station and opened the full historical file on humanity that the division maintained. 640 years of documented observation, filed under the designation GX 7714, collected by 11 different Vethsarans, observers across 4 assignment rotations. 11 observers had looked at this species for more than 6 centuries and produced a cumulative threat classification of non-combatant civilization standard. Watch protocol. Non-combatant. I read the word. I looked at the 4 new data fields on my incident form. I read the word again. My predecessor's final report, filed 22 cycles ago by an observer who was apparently perfectly satisfied with his conclusions, contained the following line: the species demonstrates low-level territorial conflict but no evidence of organized large-scale aggression toward external parties. I read this sentence and tried to understand what data he had been looking at. I went back through the archive he would have had access to. The same footage was there, the same behavioral records, the same 600 years. He had looked at the technology. That was the misfire. That was where every prior observer had stopped. The ships were small and slow. The weapons were primitive by any galactic benchmark. The communication network was loud and disorganized and broadcast in approximately 40 languages simultaneously, which is not what a unified threat looks like. So the observers looked at the tools and filed the species as limited, contained no immediate concern. They measured the hands. They did not look at what the hands kept doing after they should have stopped. I spent the next full cycle going back through the archive with different search parameters, not technology, not military output, not resource acquisition or territorial expansion. I searched for sealing events. A sealing event in xenological behavioral analysis is a moment when a species encounters a hard limit, biological or environmental or social, that its current capability cannot overcome. Every species responds to sealing events. The response pattern is one of the most reliable behavioral indicators available for long-term threat assessment. Most species, when they hit a ceiling, develop workaround behaviors. They find the path around the obstacle. This is adaptive, rational, and produces stable civilizations. Humans in 640 years of documented observation had never gone around a ceiling. They had gone through every single one. Disease ceilings, atmospheric limitation ceilings, energy resource ceilings, structural material ceilings, communication bandwidth ceilings, cognitive processing ceilings. Every time the data indicated that the species had reached the upper boundary of what was currently achievable, the next documented data point showed them on the other side of that boundary. They did not slow down when they hit the ceiling. They did not redirect. They hit it until it moved. They called this progress. The word appeared in their own documentation with the casualness of someone describing whether we made progress. It was a period of significant progress. The goal is continued progress, as though the steady removal of every limit their biology and environment placed on them was simply a feature of existing, something that happened the way seasons happen, without particular drama or intention. I searched for self-assessment accuracy. Next, I wanted to know whether they understood what they were doing, whether any human documentation acknowledged in plain terms what their behavioral pattern looked like from outside. What I found instead was a complete and consistent mismatch between their actual capability and their own perception of it. Individuals in crisis situations describing their actions afterward as, "I just did what anyone would have done. We did what we had to. There was no other option. It was nothing special." Their accounting of extraordinary events was relentlessly ordinary, as though the thing they had just done was simply the floor, the baseline, the default, and anything above it would have been remarkable. But this was just what happened when people showed up and did the work. 73% of documented human accounts of remarkable acts contain the phrase, "anyone would have." I noted this. I stared at the note. I noted it again. They did not know. That was the sentence that came, and it came without drama, the way a calibration result comes when you have been running the wrong settings and finally input the correct values. They did not know what they were. They had been doing this for 6 centuries, and they had not recognized the pattern in their own behavior. I was several hours into the archive review when I found the image. It was filed under disaster documentation from a flood event in the eastern territory of their largest continental landmass. A city had gone underwater. The documentation was thorough and clinical, the kind of record that Division Observer had compiled without editorializing. Coordinates, casualty figures, structural loss assessments, recovery, timeline projections. Attached to the document without annotation was a photograph. A child had drawn a picture of her family. I know this because the child was visible in the frame, sitting on a folding cot in a temporary shelter, holding up the drawing to show the person taking the photograph. The drawing was in crayon. The figures, simple the way children draw figures, round heads and stick figures, and features placed approximately where features go. There were 6 figures in the drawing. 3 adults, 2 children, a dog. They were standing in front of a house. House had a sun above it. Everyone in the drawing was smiling. Every figure, including the dog. The case file attached to this photograph listed the families reported. Losses in the flood, the numbers were on the page in plain text, 2 lines above. The photograph. 3 of the 6 figures in the drawing were gone. The child had made them smile anyway. I wrote 11 pages of analysis notes before I noticed how many pages I had written. I went back and read them and found that none of them said anything that the image did not already say more clearly. The notes were not analysis, they were the thing I do instead of having a response I know how to categorize. I deleted all 11 pages. I looked at the image for a long time. The child drew what she wanted to be. True, she drew the whole family, she drew the son, she drew the dog, she drew everyone smiling because the drawing was hers and she could decide what it contained, and she decided it would contain everyone and they would be fine. And the house would still be there. She was a child, she drew them smiling. Anyway, I saved the image to my personal files, not my official report. I sat back and looked at the ceiling of my observation station, and I did the thing I had been avoiding since the engagement 2 cycles ago. I followed the analysis to where it was actually pointing. The most dangerous thing about a species is not always the thing that looks the most dangerous. The graph keel looked terrifying, armored, methodical, cold. And they were dangerous genuinely in ways that required the coalition to maintain a formal deterrence posture. But the graph keel were a known quantity. You could model them, you could predict their behavior within a reliable margin. You knew what they would do and when they would stop and what conditions would cause them to retreat. The graph keel had retreated 4 times in their entire documented history. The 4th time was 3 cycles ago, from 43 humans who were still grieving, 4 of their own before the field had gone cold. The thing that made a species genuinely, categorically dangerous was not strength, it was unpredictability. It was the thing you could not model, it was the variable that your threat assessment formula had not been built to contain. The variable was this: a species that did not know its own strength had no upper limit you could calculate because the limit was internal and they had not found it, and they were not looking for it. They were just getting up every morning and going through whatever the ceiling was that week and calling it a normal day, drawing smiling families in flooded shelters, finishing obstacle courses on broken knees, standing back up from events my instruments rated as unsurvivable, and asking where they needed to be next. There is no threat model for a species whose danger is that they have not yet noticed how dangerous they are. I checked my division's classification. Library. There was no category for this. I built one. By the quiet, I hoped no one ever needed to use it. I arranged the interview through official channels, which took longer than it should have because the human military administration had a thorough process for authorizing external observer access to personnel, and their process involved 5 different approval forms and a man named Gerald at the administrative post who kept sending me the same form I had already filled out with a note asking me to please resubmit it correctly. I resubmitted it correctly 4 times. Gerald sent it back 4 times. I filed this under their bureaucracy is also somehow both inefficient and persistent. The note is somewhere in my unofficial records. The interview was granted on the 6th cycle of my observation posting. The approved subject was a veteran, currently serving in an advisory capacity to the unit I had been observing, which meant she had operational experience going back further than most of the active personnel, but was not currently deployed in the field. Her name was Nora. That was all the file said about her as a person. The rest of the file was a list of what she had done, which was long and described in the flat military language that takes extraordinary things and makes them sound like line items. I prepared for the interview the way prepare for everything. I made a list of 15 questions, expected response parameters for each question, built from behavioral modeling in the 600-year archive. I had estimated response windows, follow-up protocols, alternative question paths for 3 different behavioral profiles the subject might present. I went over the list twice on the morning of the interview and felt, as I had always felt going into an assessment interview, fully prepared. I was not fully prepared. The room they gave us was small, with a folding table and 2 chairs and a single high window that let in a flat gray light. Nora was already there when I arrived. She was sitting with one ankle crossed over the other knee, a paper cup in both hands, looking at the window with the expression of someone who has been in a lot of rooms like this one and has decided at some point to stop being bothered by it. She looked at me when I came in. "Long posting," she said. "You look tired." I had 15 questions prepared. I did not have a prepared response for this. I looked at her. She was looking at me the way I had seen humans look at things. They wanted to help. I was the thing she was looking at that way. I had no protocol for being on the receiving end of that look. I found it disorienting in a way I could not immediately quantify. "I am conducting a formal assessment interview," I said. "Sure," she said. She held the paper cup out toward me. "Do you want some of this? It is bad, fair warning." I looked at the cup. I looked at her. I took the cup. I do not know why I took the cup. I had no framework for understanding why. Took it. But I took it and I held it with both hands because it was warm and my internal temperature regulation had been slightly off for the last 2 cycles, and the warmth helped, and I sat down across from her with her cup in my hands. She seemed perfectly comfortable with this. I started with question 1. She answered it. She answered all 15 questions in order, clearly and without evasion, and her answers were useful and detailed and confirmed approximately 60% of my behavioral models for individuals with her documented history. The other 40% was what I wanted to describe carefully. Every time my questions reached a specific event in her record, a moment, my archive flagged as outside standard operational parameters. She would describe it and then add a version of the same phrase. Anyone in that situation would have made the same call. We all had the same information. The others would have done the same. I just had the angle. It was not particularly remarkable. These were not her specific words each time, but that was the consistent content. The extraordinary thing framed as the obvious thing, the remarkable outcome explained as what anyone would have done with the same inputs. I asked her, after the 8th occurrence of this, why she described those events that way. She seemed to find the question slightly confusing, not confusing in a way that made her defensive. Confusing in the way a question is. Confusing when the answer seems so obvious that you cannot immediately tell what is being asked. Because it is true, she said. Anyone in that spot with the same training, same information, same team around them, they would have done it. The data does not support that, I said. She shrugged, not dismissively. The shrug of someone who has disagreed with data before and survived the disagreement. Data is not always measuring the right things, she said. I wrote this down. I wrote it down twice. Question 14 was the one I had been building toward for 43 minutes. I had placed it near the end, deliberately after the rapport building phase in the window when subjects are most likely to respond without the formal structure of the conversation pulling at them. I asked it, "Do you know how strong you are?" She laughed. Not a proud laugh, not the laugh of someone who has been given a compliment and is deciding how to accept it. It was a tired laugh, the kind that comes out when a question has landed somewhere that finds something too worn down to do anything but respond with that sound. She shook her head a little, still with the trace of the smile on her face, looking at the table. Some days, she said, I know I am still here. That is about all I have got. I looked at her. She was still looking at the table, both hands wrapped around the paper cup she had taken back at some point during the interview, her thumbs running small circles on the side of it. Still here said as the bottom end of the scale. Still here offered as consolation, as the minimum, as the thing you say when you do not have much to report. Still here offered by a woman who had filled 14 lines of a military record with things that my behavioral model still had not finished processing. I did not ask the follow-up question. I had prepared for this item. The follow-up had been built around the expected response, which my models predicted would be one of 3 variations of confidence. Self-assessment, I had prepared responses to all 3. I had not prepared a response to still here. I did not have one. I sat with it in the way you sit with something you have been handed that you do not know where to put. She did not fill the silence. She was the kind of person who did not appear to feel the need to fill silences. She sat with her cup in the flat gray light from the high window, and she did not seem uncomfortable at all. After a while she said, "Were those all your questions?" "Yes," I said. "Thank you for your time." "Of course." She stood and was putting on her jacket, checking the pockets with the automatic efficiency of someone who always checks. On the way out, when she paused, "You should sleep," she said. "Whatever passes for that for you." Then she left. I sat in the room with the table and the 2 chairs and the flat gray light. She had left her cup on the table. It had a small dent on the side from her thumb and a mark near the rim where she had been drinking. It was a cheap disposable thing, the kind they made by the thousands, the kind no one kept. I picked it up. I should not have picked it up. It had no place in my official assessment documentation. It was a used paper cup from an interview subject. It was not data. I picked it up and held it with both hands. "Still here." She said it like it was the low end, like it was barely enough, like surviving, continuing, being present and functional in the same field you had been operating in for decades, despite everything that field had asked of you was just the floor, just the starting Point just the minimum you brought to the table. I thought about Connor standing up on the field. I thought about the woman. The archive footage with flames up her arms. I thought about Owen asking. They needed to be next with his face still wet. I thought about a child drawing everyone smiling. All of them would say, I was just still here. All of them would mean it. Not as false modesty, not as performance, as genuine settled belief. The conviction that what they were doing was ordinary, that the version of themselves that kept moving through things that should have stopped them was simply the person who showed up when it was required, not someone exceptional, not someone notable, just someone who was there and did what the moment asked. They did not know. That sentence again, the calibration. Result, the correct settings finally. Input. They did not know what they were, and that fact, sitting in the room with the paper cup warm in my hands, felt like the loneliest thing I had encountered in 30 cycles of xenological fieldwork. 600 years of extraordinary behavior. None of it recognized by the people doing it. 6 centuries of breaking ceilings and calling it a normal Tuesday. I filed 0 follow-up reports from the interview. I cataloged the cup. I put it in my kit when I left the room, next to my calibrated instruments and my official data pads, and I told myself I would properly log it later. I did not properly log it later. The cup sat on the corner of my workstation for the remainder of my posting, and every time I looked up from the data I was processing, it was there. A cheap, disposable thing with a thumb dent in the side, holding more than it was built to hold. I thought, yes, that is a fair description. The report was due at the end of the 8th cycle. I had all the data. I had more data than any prior observer assigned to this designation in the 600 years the file had been open. I had incident forms and behavioral documentation and cross-referenced archive analysis and 4 new data fields I had created myself because the standard forms had not been built to contain what I had been watching. I had everything I needed to write a complete, accurate, defensible assessment. I opened the document on the morning of the 8th cycle. I named it Xenological Threat Assessment. Designation GX7714. Classification pending. Then I sat and looked at the blinking cursor for a long time. I've done this 41 times. My hands know how to do it. The structure is fixed. Physical tier, behavioral tier, capacity, projections, threat classification, recommended response protocol. It takes me on average 6 hours to complete a full assessment for a species I have been actively observing. I had never taken longer than 6 hours. I have a solid record in this division. My supervisor in 30 cycles has sent back 2 of my reports for revision, 2 out of 41. I started with the physical tier because the physical tier was easy, and it sometimes helps to do the easy parts first. Low threat by biological metric, bone fracture probability under stress. Moderate thermal regulation efficiency. Below galactic average, unassisted speed. Insufficient to rank in the top half of cataloged species in a similar gravitational range. I wrote this section in 40 minutes, which was normal. I moved to the behavioral tier. Pain response threshold. I wrote several lines. I deleted several lines. I wrote them again. My field measurements were accurate. The problem was not accuracy. The problem was that accurate numbers Applied to what Connor had done on that field produced a document that looked like a clerical error. I kept the numbers. I left the analysis sparse. I moved on. Adaptive tactical capability. Here the writing came more easily because tactical adaptability is a category the form was designed to accommodate. I described the engagement with the graph. Keel, I described the response pattern, the forward momentum, the way the unit had absorbed losses and continued toward the objective while the graph keels. Modeling system failed to produce workable counter. I described the retreat, the fourth in. Graph keel recorded history. I read this section back. It was accurate. Every word was accurate, reading it as an isolated piece of documentation in the clinical language of the assessment form. It sounded alarming, as it should. It was alarming. I kept writing. Emotional regulation as operational asset. This was the new field I had created, the one with no prior equivalent in the division standard assessment library. I wrote about what I had observed after the engagement, the grief, the sitting with the fallen, the crying. I wrote about how this was not a productivity loss or a morale failure, but some kind of binding mechanism, a process that took loss and integrated it, and produced on the other end people who were still functional, people who could stand up and ask where they needed to be next. I wrote about how the emotional processing and the operational capacity were not in competition with each other the way my prior models had assumed. They fed each other. The grief did not slow them down. It was part of what kept them going. I wrote this section carefully. It was the section I was most unsure how to classify, and I wanted the language to be precise. Ceiling penetration, behavioral pattern. The section built from my archive. Analysis, the 600 years of limit events and their outcomes. The consistent pattern of encountering a hard boundary and simply continuing until the boundary was no longer there. I cited 12 specific historical examples across different domains, deliberately choosing ones that span different categories of limitation so the pattern was visible across type. I wrote, the species does not appear to possess a reliable internal mechanism for recognizing an unwinnable situation. What other species experience as a ceiling, this species experiences as the current state subject to change through continued application of effort. I read that line several times. It was accurate. It was also, in the context of a threat assessment, the most concerning sentence I had ever put in a report. I kept writing. Self-assessment accuracy below average. The subject population consistently underestimates individual and collective capability. This underestimate appears to be genuine and consistent across age groups, specializations, and regional demographics rather than a performance or a tactical posture. The species does not know what it is. I stopped. I read that line back. The species does not know what it is. 6 words, they sat on the page in the flat assessment language I had been using for 30 cycles, and they looked, for the first time in a report I had written, like an accusation rather than a data point, like something that needed to be addressed, though I could not have said how. I continued to the threat classification section. This is the section that the division uses. This is the section that goes up the chain of report, gets reviewed by 3 separate supervisory tiers, and eventually produces an action. Recommendation that the coalition's policy apparatus converts into a real-world posture toward the designated species. I had filled out this section 41 times. I had never produced a classification in the top 2 tiers. I looked at the data I had assembled. Pain tolerance beyond any recorded parameters in the assessment library. Adaptive tactical behavior, functional. In scenarios that had previously produced no survivors from non-Grathkiel species. Emotional resilience mechanism, no. Analogous system in any cataloged species. Ceiling penetration rate, consistent. Uninterrupted across 6 centuries. Self-awareness of capability near 0. That last item was the one that pulled the classification where it went. A species that knows it is strong has a calculable limit. You can model its decisions, you can project its behavior at the boundary of its capability. Because at the boundary it will assess the situation, weigh the probability, and make a calculation. That calculation is a vulnerability. That calculation is a place where rational deterrence works, where negotiation works, where the standard toolkit of galactic diplomacy has purchased a species that does not know it is strong has no such boundary, because the boundary is a product of self-knowledge, and the self-knowledge is not there. They do not calculate the odds and decide to continue anyway. They continue because it does not occur to them to stop, because they have never stood at the edge of their own capability and recognized it as an edge, because they get up and they go to the next thing and they call it still here. You cannot deter something that does not know it should be deterred. I typed the classification. Extreme containment risk. I looked at the words. I knew the protocol. I had been in this division long enough to know exactly what this classification said in motion. Not monitoring, not containment buffer. Zones and diplomatic distance and careful resource competition management. The division had a word for it in the procedural documentation. A clean administrative word that meant something that was not clean at all. The recommendation would go up the chain through the 3 review tiers to the policy apparatus, and the policy apparatus would act on it in the species designated GX7714. Would never know a recommendation had been made. They would just stop. And they would not know why, because they had never known how strong they were, and they would never get the chance to find out. I sat with this for a long time. The cup was on the corner of my workstation. It had been there for 4 cycles. The thumb dent was still there. The mark near the rim was still there. Some days that is about all I have got. I thought about the woman in the archive. Footage flames up her arms, laughing because someone said something funny. I thought about Connor standing up on that field with a look on his face like the situation had been impolite enough to interrupt him. I thought about Owen, 19 years old, sitting with his fallen colleagues in the dirt and then standing up and asking where they needed to be next. I thought about a child with crayons, drawing everyone smiling because she could decide what the drawing contained. I thought about Nora telling me I should sleep, whatever passes for that for you. Not as a dismissal, not as small talk. As someone who had looked at me and noticed I was tired and thought that mattered, even in a brief formal exchange with a stranger from a species she had no reason to care about at all. They do not know what they are. But she looked at me and asked if I was tired. I deleted the classification. Not the report stayed. The data stayed, the behavioral analysis. The new field categories, the ceiling. Penetration documentation, all of it. Stayed because it was true, and I had spent 30 cycles writing true things into assessment documents, and I was not going to stop now. I deleted one word. Extreme. I looked at what was left. Containment risk. I deleted that too. I looked at the empty classification. Field. In 30 cycles, I had never left a classification field empty. The assessment form required a classification. The system would flag an incomplete submission. Someone in the division's administrative office would send me a note asking me to please complete the required field. I thought briefly about Gerald. I typed classification insufficient. Extended observation recommended. I read it back. It was not accurate, and I knew it was not accurate. The data I had assembled across 8 cycles was more than sufficient for a classification, and the classification it was sufficient for was not the one I had typed. I knew this, the part of me that had spent 30 cycles being thorough and honest in its reporting knew this with complete clarity. I saved the document. I looked at the cup. I thought 30 cycles, 41 assessments, 2 reports sent back for revision, a record my supervisor once described as exemplary. I was about to file a report that did not live up to that word. And I found, sitting with the cup in the flat gray light of the observation station on the 8th cycle of my posting to an unremarkable planet at the edge of a mid-range solar system, that I could not make myself regret it. Because here is what the data actually said, not the data in the threat classification. The data underneath it, the classification was supposed to summarize but could not contain. The data said, there is a species here that breaks every ceiling it encounters and does not notice, that absorbs loss and continues and calls the continuation barely managing, that cries in the dirt and then stands up, that draws smiling families in disaster shelters, that apologizes for bleeding on someone's equipment after finishing a task that should have been impossible to finish, that sings before things that should silence anyone, that asks tired strangers from unknown species if they have had anything to eat lately. The data said they do not know. And here was the thing the data could not say, the thing that was not in any of my incident forms or behavioral reports or the 4 new fields I had created. I did not want them to find out this way. Not like this, not from a recommendation filed in clinical language that they would never read. Action by a policy apparatus they did not know existed. Ending a story that was not finished. They had not finished it 6 centuries in, and they were still going through ceilings and getting up from impossible situations and drawing suns over flooded houses. The story was not finished. I was not going to be the reason it stopped. I filed the report. Extended observation recommended. The system flagged the incomplete classification field. The automated message asked me to please complete all required sections before submission. I cleared the flag by entering a notation in the administrative comment box. Classification data collection ongoing. Reassessment pending at 60 cycle interval. The system accepted this. The report was transmitted to the division at the end of the 8th cycle. 3 weeks later, I received a message. From my supervisor, it said, "Received. Your GX771. For preliminary report, noted the incomplete classification, understood. These things take time, extended. Observation approved through standard. Renewal protocol, good work as always. Good work as always." I read the message, I read it again. Part of me that had spent 30 cycles being honest in its documentation had a very clear position on whether this constituted good work. I filed the message. I looked at the cup. I have been at the observation posting for 11 cycles now. The assessment window for GX7714 is open under the extended observation protocol. I have filed 3 supplemental behavioral reports in the past month, all under the category of continued data collection, all of them accurate, none of them containing a completed classification field. I have not spoken to Nora again. I have not had grounds to request a second interview under the current protocol parameters, but Owen passed my observation station 2 cycles ago and stopped, for no reason I could identify, to tell me that Connor's knee had healed better than the medics had initially expected, and that Elise had complained loudly and at length about the quality of the field supply shipments again, and that everyone on the unit was fairly tired of hearing about it, but also fairly confident the next shipment would be better because Elise had sent a strongly worded letter to 3 different supply offices and no one wanted a second letter. He said this the way humans say things that are not really about the subject they are discussing. He was telling me the unit was still there, that they were fine, that they were complaining about supply quality and recovering from injuries and planning next steps, and still there. I told him I was glad to hear it. I meant this in a way the words could not fully carry, but I said them anyway, because they were the closest available option. He nodded and went on his way. The cup is still on my workstation. I have moved it twice to other surfaces during data processing sessions and found myself putting it back in the corner both times without deciding to. It sits there in the flat gray light, and I look at it when the analysis is heavy and the numbers are building towards something I do not want them to build toward. I think about what Nora said, not the formal answers from the 15 questions, not the operational accounts or the useful data, the first thing before any of the questions. "You look tired." A small, thrown-away observation from a stranger in a bare room, offered freely and without cost to a being who was there to assess her and her species and decide what they were worth to the rest of the galaxy. She noticed I was tired. She offered me her cup. I have 40 cycles left in my xenological career before the Vethsaran division requires mandatory retirement. I will likely be assigned to 12 more species in that time. Some of them will be dangerous in the clean, documentable way that produces accurate threat classifications and appropriate protocol recommendations, and reports my supervisor does not send back. I will do that work. I am good at that work. I will do it the way I have always done it, methodically, without assumptions, in order. But I will have in the corner of whatever workstation I am assigned to, for the rest of those 40 cycles, a paper cup with a thumb dent in the side and a mark near the rim. And on the days when the work is heavy, I will look at it, and I will think they do not know what They are. And I will think I do. And I will think that is going to have to be enough.